Hello, everyone. My name is Suruchi Keenheel, and I'm the Director of Instructional Coaching and Training at the AIM Institute for Learning and Research. AIM Institute has had the privilege of working with Upper Darby educators and leaders for the past year and a half, and I'm really thrilled that today we get to speak with parents and guardians of the actual students of Upper Darby, and looking forward to furthering Dr. Brenner's message. You got to hear from her the importance of literacy in terms of college and career readiness. And we're going to be talking about some specific strategies that you can use at home as you're working with your students to advance those college and career readiness skills. When we start out with this conversation, we always like to bring in this metaphor, which is Hollis Scarborough's reading rope. It's a metaphor for skilled reading, and it shows that there are two major components to being able to read proficiently. One main component is word recognition, and one is language comprehension. Word recognition is something that's targeted in core instruction in the earlier grades. So in kindergarten and elementary school, your students' teachers were working on teaching students the code of the English language, being able to use the knowledge of sounds that make up our language and how those sounds connect to symbols or letters, and being able to use that knowledge to pull words off the page. The other component of skilled reading is language comprehension, and that's something that young students are introduced to as well. But language comprehension becomes the focus of reading and language arts instruction in the upper grades. So in middle school and high school, core instruction is no longer focused on the lower strands of Scarborough's reading rope. So we're not teaching for in core instruction the phonological awareness and decoding skills that students need. Those are assumed to be in place in terms of the core by middle school. And so now students are taking the knowledge that they have of reading words that are presented to them in text and then making meaning of what they've read. And so the strategies that I want to share with you have to do with background knowledge and vocabulary for starters. Vocabulary, by the way, is one particular aspect of background knowledge. But the idea is that students are going to be able to make meaning of what they read if they have some level of understanding, foundational understanding, onto which they can add the additional information they glean from a passage. So when students are reading something about baseball, if the student has a little bit of working knowledge around how the game of baseball works and what some of the terminology is that is used in that sport, then the student's going to be able to better understand what they read about baseball. A student who has that same reading level, but lack of working knowledge around baseball is going to have a tougher time with the comprehension because of that background knowledge and vocabulary that's missing. So one of the things that we can do as parents of students is to constantly be adding to our own and our students' background knowledge together. And a way to do that is just to really talk about all of the different concepts that we come into contact with every single day. This can be as simple as giving terminology for different tools that we use in the kitchen and different processes that we go through when we're cooking, right? So if a student is not only able to help out in the kitchen, but have that as an opportunity to add to their background knowledge, add to the terminology and ideas that they have about cooking, then when they encounter something in a book or magazine around cooking, they'll be able to kind of attach the new knowledge to the working knowledge they already have. One of the things that we can do as family members of students, aside from just using oral language to narrate different concepts and terms that we come in contact with every day, whether it's in the kitchen, whether it's as we're out walking in the neighborhood. We can also take virtual field trips with students in terms of the limitations that we have these days with not being able to go very many places due to COVID. One of the things that we can do is go on virtual field trips to different museums. We can take trips around the world without leaving our home. But that's a chance for students to come in contact with new knowledge and information and terms that they'll then be able to add to as they're reading a wide variety of books and other print materials. So a big takeaway is just to ensure that we are talking with students around building up different world knowledge. Also, one of the other skills that goes into those language comprehension aspects of reading are making inferences. And that's something, again, before we can infer something, before we can kind of fill in the gaps between what the author tells us and what we know, before we can fill in those gaps, we have to be able to make inferences just in day-to-day life. So before we can make inferences about what we read, we have to be able to make inferences about day-to-day things. So again, just narrating for students, things like, the reason that I'm making this particular decision is because I know this about the one option and I know this other thing about the other option. And so that tells me that option A is the best choice for us, right? It could be about anything, but just not taking for granted that students will be able to make inferences and use evidence from what they read to support what they take away from that reading that they do. We need to model that type of inference making in our day-to-day. So a lot of this just comes down to talking with students and modeling for them these different types of inference making and background knowledge building that is something that we continue to do as adults. And so if students see us doing it and then we support them with doing it, then they're going to be better set up for success when it's time to apply those skills in the context of reading. Another really important thing to do is to just make reading an activity that is a routine in the home. So if you set up a time of day where everyone in the house takes a break from what they're doing, even if it's for 15 or 20 minutes, and just comes together and reads. There's a lot of different benefits to that. One is that when students see adults in their lives reading, it makes that activity something that isn't just something we do when we're in school and something that we stop doing once we're grown. We all continue to engage with reading. And so for our students to be able to see that is really helpful. And this could look a number of different ways. It could be everyone's reading their own type of literature or magazine or whatever it may be. Also, some families will do book clubs where everyone's reading the same part of the book at the same time, and then they're having discussions around what they read. But whether everyone's reading the same thing or reading different things, it is really critical to have students have the opportunity to discuss what they have read and to hear others discuss what they have read. So sharing things like the most important lesson that you learned from what you just read during today's reading time, or asking a question. This is a question I have on my mind based on what I read, and I'm looking forward to that question getting answered when I pick up my book and continue reading tomorrow. So having those types of discussions around what we read with students, that is another really underrated but easy to do activity that supports our students with becoming avid readers. We need our students to read widely. We want them to read a variety of different types of genres of literature. We want students to be able to read read about different topics, and we call that wide reading. The idea is that students at this stage in secondary, they just need lots of practice with reading. They've been taught the strategies, and they're continuing to be taught some of the strategies, but they really need to apply that in their actual reading. So they're reading lots of different types of resources and books and on different topics. And they're getting, we call it miles on a page, right? The more practice that students get with reading different types of things, the better they're going to be at applying the different types of language comprehension skills that we want them to get really automatic with. One of the questions that I'm being asked is, my student is a reluctant reader. How do I help them be more motivated to read? And the answer there is, let me start with what the answer is not. And I think this is probably intuitive for everyone listening in, but the answer is not to force students to do something that they are unmotivated to do. So if a student is not excited about reading, it's likely because they have had some measure of difficulty with that skill, and it's human nature, we don't like to do things that we don't feel we're good at. So the best way to help a reluctant reader become more motivated with reading is to start with something that is relatively easy for them. So if you're trying to help a student pick a book that is going to be something that they're motivated to read, you want to have them start out reading something about which they have background knowledge and interest. So if a student is really reluctant to read, but they're super interested in dance, you could have them read about that topic of dance. You could have them also read, you can select reading materials with them that are not too easy, but not too hard, right? So in that just right level, where the easiest way to have students pick books that are on a level that's appropriate for them to do wide reading with is to have them read aloud a page to you and ensure that they can read most of the words independently with not a lot of effort. But you don't necessarily want them to be able to read 100% of the words accurately. So usually if they can read around 95 or so percent of the words independently, and then have to work a little bit to get that last 5%, that's going to be a good way of gauging whether that text is appropriate for the student. Because I also see a parent asking me, how important is it for me to know my child's Lexile score in being able to support them at home? Lexile scores are a piece of data, but they definitely are not going to give you a full picture of understanding whether a particular text is appropriate for your student. You're going to get a lot more by having the student read a portion of the text out loud and ensure that they're able to read most of the words independently with about 5% or so, give or take, where the student is having to do a little bit more effort at decoding that last chunk of words. Because again, a Lexile score, you might have a couple different books on the same Lexile score. One might be really appropriate for your child because they have some vocabulary and background knowledge that supports them with understanding that. And then another book on the same exact Lexile level may not be appropriate for your student because they don't have that mental Velcro where information from this book on this topic that's unfamiliar to them can attach to. So, the last thing I'm going to do is share several resources with you. To start out, this is a website from the Haskins Global Literacy Hub, and Haskins Labs, which are affiliated with Yale, we work with them at AIM Institute. So we know that the resources that Haskins puts out are high quality research-based resources. And what I want to draw your attention to in this bank of resources for parents and educators is down here in terms of more advanced readers. These are resources that are going to be appropriate for secondary level students, parents, and guardians such as yourselves. So, and some of the other resources I'm going to show you are actually linked in this Haskins global site as well. So if you're into figuring out more in depth what you can do with your student to support them with a specific type of skill, for example, if they have trouble with written composition, you're definitely going to want to check out the link here, and it has both educator and parent facing resources. This is another resource that you have access to. It's from Pact Plus. Pact stands for Promoting Adolescents' Comprehension of Text. And this was supported by the US Department of Education. And it basically gives you some strategies to use when you're supporting your child with content area reading at home, especially social studies, science, which are those dense types of texts that have lots of specialized vocabulary. So you always want to preview the text with the student and then support them with becoming independent with that skill. Whenever we're reading a content area text, we're always previewing the text, and it gives you some guidelines for what you should do when you're previewing text. Again, that daily at-home reading and discussion or writing about key ideas. Again, establishing that routine. There's a time of day where we stop what we're doing and we're going to do our reading. And then that questioning, having students ask themselves questions as they're reading and then finding the answers in the passage, but then also that discussion is critical when you are working through a text with a student. And having the student in that discussion find evidence in the text to help formulate answers to the questions that they are answering. Discussing key ideas and how they relate to your lives or the world. This adds on to students' background knowledge over time. So that's why that's important. And then for challenging passages, breaking up the text into sections and reading them one at a time. So taking something that's got lots of pieces and really honing in paragraph by paragraph so that the student can get that modeling of how we take larger, more complex texts and chunk them out. So this is another really helpful resource that you have access to. In terms of different literature that students can engage with, aside from what you may have in your home library or what you're able to access through the Delaware County Library System, which is great and has lots of resources that are electronic as well. So if you're avoiding going to the physical library right now, you still have the opportunity to check out books online. Another resource is this one. LitToGo has a large online collection of free books to access, and you can check them out based on author, book title, genre, and then there are collections. And also, if you're not sure where to go in terms of reading level, they also have some approximate grade levels where you can kind of play around in these grade bands. Again, this is not a perfect science. So you wouldn't say, I have an 8th grader, so everything in the 8th grade band is going to be appropriate for my student and nothing in the 7th grade or 9th grade bands will. It's not the case, but this is kind of a rough way of categorizing different texts into some semblance of reading levels. And then from there, you can get a sense, okay, if your student is pretty comfortable in the 9th grade level texts that they've read so far, then you kind of might want to look in that area, keeping in mind that some of the 8th grade level texts may be appropriate because they may be on topics that are not as familiar to your student. Some of the 10th grade level texts that are about topics that are very familiar to your student might also be appropriate for your 9th grade level reader. So definitely take these grade levels with a grain of salt, but know that LitToGo has the ability to search different types of texts, both classics as well as some new texts for free and online. The last thing I'm going to share is if I go back to this reading rope, I mentioned that the word recognition strands and those more foundational literacy skills are no longer taught in core instruction in secondary. If you have a student who is struggling with those foundational skills, you may want to speak with your child's teaching team, with administrators to find out if they qualify for services where they would get instruction that would fill in any gaps in those foundational skills. And then also you'll want to think about assistive technology. So we've got some resources that we recommend. All of the resources I'm about to share have free light versions. Some of them have premium versions that cost money. But the first one I want to share is Read and Write. And this is a software toolbar that helps students create and access content with the literacy support features that they need for a personalized learning experience. So some of the features that this resource has include the ability to hear documents read out loud, hear emails read out loud. They have word prediction software, picture dictionaries, grammar and spelling checkers, as well as confusable word checkers. And this integrates really well with Google Chrome. So it can be used for a lot of different tasks. And the basic version of Read and Write is free. Another one that I'm going to share with you is Inspiration Maps. And this encourages deep critical thinking, creativity. And so it's a tool that uses visual diagrams and written outlines to take notes and add details. So it turns those static outlines into really dynamic maps for your students. And that can often help students with their thinking and inference making and pre-writing before they get into writing some more complex passages. The last assistive technology resource that I'll share is called SnapType. This helps students keep up with their peers in class, even if their penmanship pulls them back. So for students who are having trouble with writing in a legible way quickly, this allows students to take a picture of any worksheet using the iPad camera or iPhone, and then or import a worksheet from email or a photo library or Google Drive. And then students can use their keyboard to add text to the document. So instead of having to handwrite, they can type directly into whatever worksheet they're assigned, and then they can print, email, and share their creations. So these are three resources that are on the resource list that you can access to support your students with those foundational skills. But overall, with secondary readers, we just want to make sure that at home they are getting lots of practice with reading, lots of different types of books, that they're seeing lots of reading and high quality discussion around books modeled, and that there's lots of rich discussion around books, but otherwise too. We want to make sure that that background knowledge, vocabulary, and ability for students to make inferences, even outside of text, is strong, because then students will be able to use those skills in service of reading comprehension. Thank you so much for your attention and good luck. And we look forward to continuing our partnership with Upper Darby School District in the future.